Good morning. I am Felisa Hackizer, ESD's Director of Compliance, and I'd like to welcome you to the meeting of Empire State Development's Governance Committee for Monday, July 12th, 2021. We will begin with a few formalities and note for the record that this meeting is being webcast and the committee members have received the relevant agenda in advance of today's meeting and are free to ask questions at any time. I'd like to further note that after each item is presented and any comments are received from the committee members, we would normally allow members of the public to provide comments. I'd like to state for the record that the members of the public are not present in today's meetings. We have a newly constituted governance committee, and as a director of compliance, I look forward to working with you. We plan to meet a few times a year to discuss governance issues based on the directives of the Public Authorities Law. We have two objectives for this meeting. The first is to select a chair of the governance committee, and the second is to provide an overview of the project approval process for discussion. So I'd like to ask for nominations for chair of the governance committee.
I would like to nominate my colleague and the esteemed member of the New York academic world at NYU and the Wagner School, Sherry Gleed.
And I'd like to second that motion.
Very good. Do we have to take a vote? All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? Very good. Ms. Gleed, welcome to chair of the governance committee.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now
Don't forget to update your website.
and LinkedIn.
Yes, LinkedIn for sure.
Now we're going to turn to an overview of the project approval process, and I'd like to ask ESD Chair Steve Cohen to provide some initial thoughts.
Thank you, and congratulations and welcome to our new chair. I joined the ESD board about 11 months ago, maybe it's 10 months ago, and I was generally familiar with the way ESD operated from my stint as secretary to the governor, which lasted for a very short period of time. It's now a decade ago. And one of the things that has sort of struck me over the last 10 months and 10 years is that as a governance matter, things are structured historically in a way that we end up with an approval process that I think oftentimes loses the benefit of board input. And oftentimes, because of the structure, and again, I think this process is more than 15 years old. I think it predates the Pataki administration. It may go back to the origins of UDC. But what ends up happening is effectively the board is approving projects where we're really approving the release of funds. And I think there's an argument that really isn't the best form of governance. Now, again, I think that because this has been the way it's been done for so long, and because it solves a host of other problems, including the fact that a number of projects, a huge number of projects where there may be an agreement to provide a potential incentive, never come to fruition. I mean, that's just the nature of business. You make an offer, doesn't necessarily come to fruition. So that the number of incentives the staff is working on probably overrepresents what ultimately is agreed upon, plus issues of confidentiality. And so I think for all of those reasons, there was some logic to the process that had the staff approving certain things, and then only really coming to the board when it came time to release those funds. But the problem with that is that it really blurs the issue of what approval means. And I raised the notion of maybe we should take a fresh look at this. Maybe we should think about how it could be that on the front end or earlier in the process, the board is involved in some way, and that we look at the level of delegations. Right now, the board has delegated to the executive staff. In most instances, it's to the CEO and president. In this instance, it's Eric Ertler. Authority at $250,000 to enter into contracts and binding agreements. In today's world, that number is very low if you think about it. And so part of the issue, I think, is to get that piece of it readjusted as well, that not everything should be coming to the board. I don't think there is necessarily a world in which you need a one-size-fits-all. Certain kinds of agreements and initiatives may require a lower threshold for review. Others may require a higher. And I happen to believe that what we ought to be doing is embracing the expertise that exists among the staff. When the board needs to get involved, that's great. But I think those instances should be less frequent. But when they are taking place, they probably should be earlier. So, my suggestion, um, Felice and Liz Fine agreed to start taking a look at this and advise the governance committee on their views.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Chair Cohen. What I think I'm going to do now is provide the governance committee with some data that the staff has gathered on the process, sort of foster some conversation with the goal of getting your feedback and input, and then we'd have ESD staff come back with some proposals for some governance changes after that. Okay. So as Steve said, historically projects have been brought to the board when they reach a milestone or are complete. There are some legal reasons for that timing. For instance, secret environmental review, which is the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which requires that process to be complete before any action taken by the board. So we would wait usually for the process to be completed before we brought things to the board. And as Steve also mentioned, the idea of trade secrets and confidentiality, protecting a business's trade secrets, which we're required to do by law. So nevertheless, the board has asked for ways they can be informed earlier on the process. So I'm going to present some data on project generation. ESD enters into incentive proposals, we like to call IPs, lots of acronyms in government. And we looked at the data from 2018 and 2019. ESD makes about 700 project offers per year. A third of those involve only Excelsior job tax credits, which means that they stay within the purview of our agency arm, DED, and they do not come to the board. That leaves us with about 460 IPs, and some of those are not successful, so about 300 IPs are coming to either the board or the CEO for consideration. Of those 300, 50% are under 250,000, 25% are between 250,000 and $1 million, and 25% are over 1 million. And of those 300, about 50% of the IPs were advanced in the RIDC process, which is the Regional Economic Development Council.
I'm sorry?
50%.
50%, okay.
Sorry about that. So,
and those are distributed among all sizes.
right.
And you know the REDC
Yeah.
process, okay.
So, and IPs are generated from all areas of business within ESD, business development, RIDC, at the discretion of venture capital, life sciences. So the IPs come from all areas. And we were talking about a number of high-level proposals for your consideration. One was different times that we would bring incentive proposals to the board based on different legal considerations and what's practical. So for instance, projects that required secret review, which is, an impediment of law, if you will, we would bring those later, maybe 120 days, maybe more. And we talked about perhaps some discretion in the IP language that would allow ESD staff to extend that time if necessary. And then we're also talking about, as Steve mentioned, changing some board thresholds to accommodate for, sort of the economy of the times, and perhaps different areas of ESD would have different thresholds. So I'd like to open up to conversation now based on that data.
So just to clarify, because I'm pretty new to this, very new to this, if the proposals were to come to the board earlier, when in the life cycle of a proposal would they be coming? I mean, they are now coming, it's like years later, right?
Yes.
When would they be coming in that case?
Well, the staff's going to examine this, but we were talking about sort of a staggered.
So take the ones that don't require environmental review. Let's just take the simple ones first.
Right.
So how would that happen?
Well, after an incentive proposal was signed by the parties, and we determined that there was, no particular legal impediment, it might be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, depending on the project.
So it would be, and that would be several years before the moment where it comes to the board now, in effect.
Correct.
Potentially.
Yeah, I think the idea here is, on the one hand, you don't want to get away in the way of the staff, and you don't want. I don't think we want to ever have a situation where the board is not relying upon the judgment of the staff. I think of this in terms of if this were pure corporate governance. you'd have a situation where the board is informed of things that are material and relevant, consistent with whatever the corporate delegation of authority would be, which probably would be much higher. On the other hand, because of the nature of the way this works, the board is ultimately approving the release of
Right.
funds. And I think there's a checking mechanism there that we never want to get away from. So I don't think you need to do it before an agreement is entered into. In fact, I think it would be an impediment to the staff operating for you to have to go to the board before you entered into an agreement with Legoland
Right.
to provide a grant that will help them build out their new adventure park. But I think shortly after the agreement is entered into, and by shortly I mean 30, 60, 90 days, in some instances you could even argue 120 days, but before you're so far down the path that it is effectively the board is merely acting on a fait accompli,
Right.
then it could come to the board. And I think 99% of the time, 98% of the time, it's not a rubber stamp, but you're deferring to the expertise of the staff. And I think
So what would happen if the board at that point, just to walk it through, if the board at that point said, no, we think there's a problem here?
I don't think you're so far down the process that you couldn't send them back. And as I envision this, in those rare instances where the board is raising a hand saying, we want to know more, that's what they're saying. They're saying, we want more information. We want to understand, or maybe we want to tweak this. I think it is the rare case where the board is ever going to want to substitute its judgment
Right.
for the judgment of the professionals in the agency.
And just a little more context, the IPs and the projects that we're talking about are one piece of what the board does, but it is probably the only area where the board acts after a lot of the work is done. So that, if it's a venture capital investment, it's before the investment is made. If it's a real estate project, it's before the real estate project is undertaken. And that's true of a lot of our work and a lot of what the board does, but this is a little bit of an outlier in that regard.
I'm just trying to think through what you want to do is set up a structure where it isn't going to hold back staff process, but the board is still going to have some opportunity to say something. That's in the timing of it. I guess that's the issue.
Yeah, and look, I would almost put in the incentive proposal itself a line that says within, and leave it to the discretion of the staff. I mean, we can say as a matter of guidance, no later than six months after it's entered into, but that they should, in fact, it's in the interest of the recipient to move that time up to the shortest possible time, because they don't want to be at risk.
Right.
But that within, call it 90 days or 120 days, it'll be presented to the board, and the board will have an opportunity to. And again, I think we have to really ask ourselves: are we seeking approval here, or that the board has to be provided with notice and an opportunity to comment? And I'm not sure what the answer
I mean,
is.
in those agreements, there's enough contingencies anyways.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think one of the
Adding
things
that
that's
is
nice about this is that there is a kind of living aspect of it, in the sense that as decisions should be being made now, and right now what we're seeing are decisions that were made 4 or 5 years ago. And so to the extent that some direction change or something is being thought about, it can't really inform the process, because by the time we see something, it was 5 years ago, right? So it might not be that any particular investment was changed because of the board, but at least the board would know where things are going and could then make a policy recommendation to the management saying, we noticed that you're approving a lot of proposals that have this form. Maybe you should be shifting in this direction at a macro level, not on a project level, which is hard to do when the projects were decided 5 years ago.
Yeah, and look, I think that we're in a transition phase. And again, to give more color to how some of this happened, remember that there have been instances in which the chair and the CEO have been the same person. There have been instances when they have not been the same person. And so I think it felt a lot more comfortable when the chair and the CEO are the same person. Still, I mean, I've heard over the years, not in recent years, but certainly in 2003 2014, 2015, I think some board members, I think it was Liz was here for some of it, were frustrated because they felt like, they wanted to have more visibility and input into what the agency is doing. And I think this will go a long way in making the board feel as if, they have some insight and some ability to steer policy. And by the way, I don't even think it's steering policy. I think it's making sure that policy is being carried out, which inevitably, at least my experience in the last, 10 months has been that it is being carried out. It's
Yeah,
not.
I mean, it seems like everything is fine. It's
Yeah.
more just, it's an odd thing as a board member to have your oversight function simply be like, has the hotel been built or not? Like,
Right.
And we've given this a lot of thought, and I think there's a lot of work we can do in coming up with some proposals. There have been some challenges that we've been dealing with. Secra is one of them, and we have to sort through that. There's also the reality that a lot of the projects change repeatedly and sometimes significantly. So there's going to be a question of how and when to bring a project back to the board. And then there's public hearings. When do we have a public hearing? And what, as a corporation, what kind of funding commitments do we have to have internally if the board is involved at the front end, even knowing that many of the projects won't succeed?
Come to fruition.
Not many, a few.
this all sounds very sensible to me, but I do think it's important that it not impede the staff's work and being able to get the money out the door. And so I defer to people who have law degrees about what the right way to structure this. I mean, it could just be a notice function, and then
Yeah.
there's less of an issue
To the board.
Yeah.
to the board.
Mhm.
But at least sort of thinking through sort of bad cases, right? Something happens that people don't like. The board is going to be seen as responsible for it. It would be nice to know that it were happening. To not have known at all that it was happening until it was at the end would seem problematic, even if that never happens, right? But
But I think that's right. If you have notice, you can then decide in those circumstances if there's something larger or more that the board needs to get involved in. Otherwise, you're involved and have that notice check,
right,
and then you can oversee.
I think it's more about informing the board than sort of the moment at which information passes to the board, rather than actually trying to figure out what the right answer here is in terms of whether the thing should go forward or not. That shouldn't be our job.
One of the things that's important with regard to the incentive proposals is that businesses use them to secure financing.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to in any way hinder that.
No. And I
some of
guess
them
the other
require-
issue here is the publicness of it. So that's just a thing to think about. So does that mess things up in some way? Since they are going to use it to secure financing, is it good or bad if it becomes more broadly known? I don't know.
Right, that's often a case-by-case basis, but confidentiality and trade secrets is a very important part of this process.
And some of them require NDAs to be signed.
Correct.
We don't like doing that, but some of them do require it.
Look, I think in some instances, you're either going to have the notification to the board. I think this is not the norm, but there will be instances where information may not be disclosed to the board, certainly not in a public meeting, which is fine. The board can know what the project is. In some instances, I think, there will be, I hate to use a term from the Iran-Contra affair, but I think the phrase there was delayed notification. That's what got Oliver North into a lot of trouble. We'll try to avoid that problem. Maybe we should avoid, giving grants to people selling tow missiles to the Iranians. But I think that there are probably, an array of options that can be developed to make sure that we don't impede the staff.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay.
So we can come back with some proposed, practices for the board. And do you want us also to come up with some proposed threshold changes?
Makes sense. And
Yeah,
if they are different across the organization, that makes sense too.
yeah, and the example I've used before is we have a venture fund, and that venture fund has the same delegation of $250,000. Well, the venture fund has its own, I think it's called the board, and that board has expertise and are fiduciaries. I find it a little odd that we're then passing on the judgment of the experts in the venture fund. In fact, I'm hard pressed to ever come up with an example in which the board would ever second guess what the venture fund has chosen to
And
do.
we're not leading on any of these investments. We're
Right.
following
Right.
another venture fund that's done all the due diligence, and then we've done all our due diligence. And then it's gone to a set of experts, and then it's come to the board.
Right. So if you think about it
there's
as a
bunch of checks
continuum,
on that.
it seems to me that's all the way at the other end. That I don't, if I were designing this with the right to sort of rethink it, but my gut reaction on that would be on an annual basis, we should find out what their metrics are, what they're doing in a forward-looking basis, and then on an annual basis, find out how they've performed to get a representation that they've complied with all those things, and take this board, the ESD board, out of it because we've got nothing to offer. And as a fiduciary, I think we've acquitted ourselves by delegating our authority to a board of experts. So, if you think of that as one bookend, and then at the other bookend, there may be certain things where we say, no, we really do want to know because of the nature of it. And then most things are going to fall in the middle, where it's sort of a light, a light understanding that what is moving forward is consistent with, the mission statement, the goals, and the strategy of the agency, without getting in anybody's way.
So what would be the timing? Do you want this for this? I mean, ultimate or the process first of all. So you come up with a bunch of suggestions. It comes back to the governance committee. The governance committee decides. Then it's got to go to the full board, or it stays within the governance. I mean,
I think it has to go to the full board
Right, I
because
think
it's
so
a
too.
different delegation of
Right.
authority to the staff. But I think that the proposals on the IP process are probably further along. And, the issues about the threshold beyond IPs, I don't know whether we'll be ready right away or not, but, because there's the venture, as long as we're looking at it, we might want to look at procurements as well and other types of approvals that the board does. I don't know.
Look, I think we've got my own reaction is we should phase this in. So there are some things that we know are easy. I mean, the venture fund is an example. I think coming up with the pure grants, you put REDCs in one bucket. The more, my own instinct is the more the agency is directly involved, the more discretion, my view is, that is warranted. The REDC process, with all due respect, and I do respect that process, it's a different process that you could argue requires more oversight because of the nature of the process. Now, it's provided within the agency, but just thinking about it as a fiduciary, it strikes me that you have a duty to be more involved there. When Jeff Januszewski and his group on their own is deciding, this high-tech venture in upstate New York is worth being involved in, and this is what their recommendation is, I'm less concerned about that, even though they're backstopping the REDCs too. But I'm less concerned. So you could see keeping the REDC at $250,000 as the threshold, giving Jeff and his group greater discretion, moving that number up. I'll make it up. So no great moment, but you could say that's 500,000. The venture fund is an annual report, and and then you figure out where everything lies in between. And then I think what you then run into are the sort of the other different things we're dealing with, and we've got to create some harmony on the things that are already coming to the board. So, for example, small business type funds that come to the board up front, you could argue that Pravina and her group should be given more discretion so that they don't have to come to the board with everything. You could also argue, and then I would almost think this is sort of phase two to look at, when what you're doing is following a legislative prescription that has been approved by the governor. I mean, again, to me, I don't know what more the board has to add other than knowing that there's a representation that they're complying with the law. I mean, the board, we've dealt with some of this before on the the non-discretionary consent calendar, which is no longer called the non-discretionary consent calendar, where what we're really doing is acting as an administrative agency to oversee the directives of the legislature as approved by the governor. I mean, I think there's not a whole lot we have to offer there, because even if we were second guessing it, it would simply be to say we're not doing it, which would create a conflict. And I'm not even sure, except in a very rare instance, how that wouldn't be a breach of our obligations to say, you know, we're going to second guess the legislature and the governor. I just don't know how you do that. So, but I think, you know, the first group of issues I think are relatively easy to tackle, and then we've just got to move out from there. And so I would imagine that, you know, this is a 3-step process.
Okay.
But I mean, if there's a way to do a presentation, not at the next board meeting, the next board meeting is in 3 days or 4 days, I think you should give the board an update. Then at the August meeting, which despite the fact that we're trying to make it a quick meeting, now it looks like it's becoming a longer meeting, maybe we could do step 1, and then September, you know, step 2, and then, you know, update the board on what's remaining. I think that strikes me as realistic and manageable.
I think that's doable. Great. If there are no further questions or comments, we can adjourn.
I just want to note one thing.
Yes.
First of all, you guys have done a great job. Eric has been enormously helpful on this. But this is, I don't think we made note of it, our first in-person,
Yes.
right, public meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I want everybody to know I feel safe and healthy. And I appreciate the fact that you are appropriately distanced from me.
Thank you. And I want to just thank Jane and Debbie, who worked so hard, and everything
Thank you.
seems very simple to put together, but to put together the first
Yep.
in-person meeting.
And I will
is a big
say, I
challenge.
know I'm driving Debbie crazy, and I apologize.
No,
but I
I'm
appreciate
getting crazier than you are. I'm the disaster.
The
And I'll jump in as well and thank our new board chair for taking on this added responsibility. So thank you.
She'll ultimately teach a class in this.
Okay.
Terrific. Do we actually need a motion to adjourn?
Yes, we do.
Then I will make the motion.
I'll second it.
All in
Aye.
favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Terrific.
We are adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was nice and sweet.